welcome, and a very good evening to you. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your day has held, I'm truly glad you've chosen to unwind here, in this quiet corner of history. As the world outside settles into stillness, I invite you to let go of the day's tensions. Take a deep breath, and let's journey together to a time long past. I'm always curious to know, it's a lovely thought that connects us all. Where are you listening from tonight? And what's the hour there? Let me know in the comments. If you find comfort in drifting off to these tales from the past, consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss our next journey into history's deeper mysteries. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come. Now, as you get comfortable, let's begin. They didn't just kill their enemies, they devoured them. On ancient battlefields soaked in blood, cannibalism was not madness. It was war strategy. From ritual sacrifice to consuming commanders for power. This is the terrifying history of warriors who believed victory wasn't complete until they'd tasted flesh. Imagine a battlefield soaked in blood, where victory isn't just measured in land or gold, but in flesh. Where the ultimate humiliation isn't death, but being devoured by your conqueror. This is the untold story of ancient warriors who didn't just defeat their enemies, they consumed them. Why? The answer will haunt you. Imagine standing on a field of the dead. The air is thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of smoke. Around you, the groans of the wounded fade into silence, replaced only by the cawing of carrion birds circling overhead. Your comrades lie motionless, their bodies broken, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. But the real horror isn't the killing, it's what comes after. This isn't a story about starvation. This isn't about desperate men driven to unthinkable acts by the gnawing pains of hunger. This is about power, raw, unbridled power. This is about warriors who didn't just kill their enemies, they ate them. Not for sustenance, not for survival, but to break their spirits, to shatter their souls, to send a message so terrifying, so visceral, it would echo through the ages. We do not just conquer, we consume. From the dense, shadowed jungles of South America to the sun-drenched islands of the Pacific. From the towering, blood-stained temples of the Aztecs to the mud-choked battlefields of medieval Europe. The practice of warfare cannibalism was more than a tactic. It was a philosophy, a belief so deeply ingrained it shaped entire civilizations. The flesh of your enemy wasn't just food, it was fuel. Their bones weren't just remains, they were relics of dominance. Their essence wasn't just memory, it was a force to be absorbed, a power to be wielded. The Wari people of Brazil didn't just see their enemies as threats, they saw them as prey. Hunting, killing, and eating another human wasn't an act of desperation for them. It was an act of justice, a sacred ritual. When a Wari warrior took a life, he didn't just end it, he erased it. He ensured that his enemy's spirit could never rise again, that their name would never be whispered in fear or reverence. To the Wari, cannibalism wasn't a crime. It wasn't even taboo. It was a duty, a solemn, necessary duty to protect their people, their land, their way of life. And if you think this was confined to the so-called primitive corners of the world, think again. Because when the Crusaders laid siege to the Syrian town of Ma'ara in the winter of 1098, they didn't just slaughter the inhabitants, they butchered them. They boiled their bodies in vast cauldrons, and then they ate them. Not because they were starving, not because they had no other choice, but because their hatred ran so deep, so black, that it turned human flesh into a weapon, a way to say, you are nothing, you are not even worthy of a grave. You are food for the dogs and for us. This is the truth we've buried, the truth that claws at the edges of our comfort, that makes us shift in our seats and glance away. Because cannibalism in warfare isn't just about eating, it's about erasing, it's about control. It's about making sure your enemy is gone, not just from the battlefield, but from history itself. It's about writing your name in blood and bone, ensuring that your legend outlives theirs. And the most terrifying part, it worked. For centuries, The mere threat of being eaten struck fear into the hearts of warriors. It broke armies before they even raised their swords. So ask yourself, if you were on that battlefield, if the fate of your people rested on your shoulders, if you were the one holding the blade, could you do it? Could you look into the eyes of the man you just killed, feel the warmth leave his body and then take a bite? Could you convince yourself that his flesh would make you stronger, that his death would make you immortal? This is the story of the conquerors who ate their enemies. It's a story of power, of fear, of the lengths humans will go to in the name of victory. And it begins with a question that will haunt you long after the screen fades to black. What if the greatest fear in war isn't dying, but being eaten? If this story sent a chill down your spine, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Part 2 is coming soon, where we dive into the Aztec Empire, a civilization where human flesh wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a sacred offering to the gods. You won't believe what they did in the name of their deities. The act of eating your enemy wasn't just about the physical consumption, it was about the psychological warfare that came with it. The terror of being devoured was a weapon more powerful than any sword or spear. Because when you ate your enemy, you weren't just killing him, you were erasing him. You were making sure that his name, his legacy, his very existence would be swallowed up by history. And in a world where reputation was everything, where the fear of your name could win battles before they even began, this was the ultimate power move. The Wari of Brazil understood this better than anyone. To them, warfare wasn't just about land or resources, it was about vengeance. It was about justice. And the only true justice for a fallen comrade was to consume the flesh of the enemy who killed him. Because in their eyes, the enemy wasn't just a man, he was a predator. And the only way to truly defeat a predator was to become one yourself. When a Wari warrior captured an enemy, the ritual began immediately. The captive was bound, his hands tied behind his back, his legs hobbled so he couldn't run. He was paraded through the village, the women and children spitting at him, the warriors taunting him, the chiefs already deciding which parts of his body would be theirs to eat. Because in Wari culture, the act of eating your enemy wasn't just a personal victory, it was a communal one. A way to bind the tribe together in a shared act of defiance and strength. The killing was swift, a blow to the head with a club, a slash across the throat with a sharpened bone. But the butchering was deliberate. The Wari didn't just hack at the body, they treated it with the same care they would a deer brought down in the hunt. The legs were separated at the joints, the arms removed with precision. The chest was split open, the heart and liver carefully extracted. Because this wasn't just about eating, it was about respect. A respect for the enemy's strength, for the life he had lived, and for the power he now had to give. The cooking was done in large clay pots, the flesh boiled with herbs and roots until it was tender. The scent of cooking meat filled the village, a reminder to everyone that the enemy had been defeated, that the tribe was strong, that they were untouchable. And when the meat was ready, it was divided among the warriors, the chiefs, the elders. Each bite was a declaration. We are not afraid. We are not weak. We are the ones who eat our enemies. But the Wari didn't just eat their enemies out of hatred. They did it out of necessity. Because in their world, where raids and counter-raids were a way of life, where the death of a loved one could only be avenged by the death and consumption of the enemy, this was the only way to keep the cycle of violence in check. It was a brutal form of justice, but it was justice nonetheless. And it wasn't just the Wari who practiced this. Across the globe, from the islands of the Pacific to the jungles of South America, from the battlefields of Europe to the temples of the Aztecs, the act of eating your enemy was a way to assert dominance, to send a message, to ensure that your name would be remembered long after your bones turned to dust. But here's the question that lingers. If you were in their place, if you were fighting for your survival, for the survival of your people, could you do it? Could you look into the eyes of the man who killed your brother, your father, your son, and take a bite? Could you convince yourself that his flesh would make you stronger, that his death would make you invincible? Because in the end, that's what this was about. Not just the act of eating, but the act of surviving, of ensuring that your people would live, that your name would be remembered, that your enemies would think twice before ever crossing you again. And so, the feasts continued. Generation after generation, tribe after tribe, enemy after enemy, until the world changed, until the outsiders came, until the old ways were buried beneath the weight of new gods and new laws. But the stories remain. The legends persist. And the question still haunts us. What would you do to survive? The Aztecs didn't just eat their enemies. They believed they were nourishing the gods. Their empire was built on a sacred cycle of blood, sacrifice, and divine communion. The flower wars weren't fought for land or gold, but for captives. Warriors so brave, so skilled, that their deaths would be worthy of the gods. When a captive was led up the temple steps, he wasn't a prisoner. He was a vessel, a temporary home for the divine, dressed in sacred regalia. His final moments were a ritual, his death a gift to keep the universe alive. The priest's obsidian blade cut through his chest in a single fluid motion. His heart, still beating, was torn out and raised to the sun, the ultimate offering. The body wasn't discarded. It was butchered with precision, the flesh cooked and shared among the elite. The Aztecs didn't see this as cannibalism. To them, the flesh was no longer human. It was divine, a sacred meal to sustain the gods and the world. The Spanish conquistadors were horrified. Hernan Cortés wrote of demonic rituals, of temples drenched in blood, of skulls stacked like trophies. He used these images to justify his conquest, to paint the Aztecs as monsters. But the Aztecs saw themselves as the custodians of life. They believed that without their sacrifices, the sun would stop moving, the rains would cease, and the world would end. So they fed the gods, with blood, with flesh, with the lives of their enemies. The feasts that followed weren't acts of gluttony. They were acts of faith. The nobles and warriors who consumed the flesh believed they were absorbing the strength, the courage, the very essence of the sacrificed. They weren't eating a man. They were partaking in the divine. The Spanish called it barbarism. The Aztecs called it devotion. The captives weren't just prisoners, they were chosen. The Aztecs believed the gods favored the brave, that the strongest warriors were the most worthy sacrifices. So when a captive was brought to the temple, he was paraded through the streets, his body painted with sacred symbols, his final steps treated with reverence. Because in those moments, he wasn't just a man, he was a god. The ritual didn't end with the sacrifice. The body was carefully butchered, the flesh cooked in clay pots, seasoned with chilies and herbs and served on platters of gold. The elite gathered to eat, not as a meal, but as communion. They believed that with every bite, they were becoming closer to the gods, absorbing the divine power of the warrior they had sacrificed. The Spanish saw only monstrosity. They wrote of blood-drunk savages, of a people so lost to darkness that they had to be saved or destroyed. But the Aztecs saw the Spanish as the true barbarians, men who killed without purpose, who took without giving, who destroyed without understanding. The Aztecs believed they were sustaining the universe. The Spanish believed they were saving souls. And this is where the question lingers. If you believed truly, deeply believed, that your actions kept the sun in the sky, that your sacrifices prevented the end of the world, could you do it? Could you stand on that temple, blade in hand, and tell a man his death would save everything? Could you eat his flesh, not in hunger, but in reverence? The Aztecs could, and they did. For centuries, they built an empire on this belief, until the day the Spanish arrived with their gods and their guns, and the old ways were buried beneath the weight of a new world. But the question remains, was it savagery, or was it faith? The Aztecs didn't just eat their enemies, they believed they were feeding the gods themselves. Their empire was built on a sacred cycle of blood, sacrifice, and divine communion. The flower wars weren't fought for land or gold, but for captives. Warriors so brave, so skilled, that their deaths would be worthy of the gods. When a captive was led up the temple steps, he wasn't a prisoner. He was a vessel, a temporary home for the divine, dressed in sacred regalia. His final moments were a ritual, his death a gift to keep the universe alive. The priest's obsidian blade cut through his chest in a single fluid motion. His heart, still beating, was torn out and raised to the sun, the ultimate offering. The body wasn't discarded. It was butchered with precision, the flesh cooked and shared among the elite. The Aztecs didn't see this as cannibalism. To them, the flesh was no longer human. It was divine, a sacred meal to sustain the gods and the world. The moment the heart was torn from the captive's chest, the ritual was only beginning. The body was carried to the temple courtyard, where the butchering was done with surgical precision. The limbs were separated at the joints, the skin peeled back in strips, the organs removed and placed in ceremonial bowls. Every part of the body had a purpose. The heart went to the sun god, Huitzilopochtli. The blood was offered to the earth to ensure fertile crops. The flesh was reserved for the nobles, the warriors, the priests, those who had earned the right to consume the divine. The cooking process was sacred. The meat was never simply roasted or boiled. It was prepared with rituals that had been passed down for generations. The flesh was marinated in a mixture of chilies, herbs, and the blood of the sacrificed, then slow cooked in clay pots over open fires. The aroma that filled the temple courtyards wasn't just the smell of cooking meat. It was the scent of devotion, of a people fulfilling their sacred duty. The feast itself was a carefully choreographed event. The nobles sat in a circle, the highest-ranking priests presiding over the meal. The meat was served on golden platters, each piece offered first to the gods before being consumed. The warriors who had captured the sacrificial victim were given the first bites, a reward for their bravery in battle. The priests would chant hymns as the meat was eaten, their voices rising and falling in rhythm with the drums that echoed through the temple walls. But this wasn't just about eating, it was about becoming. The Aztecs believed that by consuming the flesh of their enemies, they were absorbing their strength, their courage, their very essence. A warrior who ate the heart of his captive believed he was taking on his bravery. A priest who consumed the liver believed he was gaining his wisdom. This wasn't cannibalism as we understand it. It was transformation, a way to elevate themselves, to become more than human, to bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. The Spanish conquistadors, when they first witnessed these feasts, were disgusted. They saw only barbarism, only savagery. They wrote in their letters home about the horrific rituals and the bloodthirsty priests, using these descriptions to justify their conquest. But what they failed to understand was that to the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. They believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and now it was their turn to return the favor. Without these sacrifices, they believed the sun would stop moving, the rains would cease, and the world would end in darkness. The Aztecs didn't just accept this belief, they embraced it. They built their entire civilization around it. Their calendar was structured around sacrificial rituals. Their wars were fought not just for territory, but for captives to feed the gods. Their temples were designed as stages for these divine performances. The steps leading up to the altar, symbolizing the journey from the earthly realm to the divine. Even their art and poetry were filled with references to sacrifice, to the cycle of life and death that kept the universe in balance. And yet, despite the horror the Spanish felt, there was a strange kind of logic to it. The Aztecs lived in a world where the line between the sacred and the profane was blurred, where death wasn't an end but a transition, where the flesh of your enemy wasn't just food. It was the most sacred offering you could make. They didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as the ones who kept the world turning. But here's the part that's hardest to understand. They didn't just believe this, they knew it. To them, the evidence was all around them. The sun rose every morning because of their sacrifices. The rains came every season because of their offerings. The crops grew because the earth was nourished by blood. They didn't see their rituals as barbaric. They saw them as essential. And so when the Spanish arrived, when they called the Aztecs savages and set out to destroy their temples and their way of life, the Aztecs didn't just fight for their empire. They fought for their truth, for the belief that had sustained them for centuries, for the gods who had given them everything. But in the end, the Spanish guns and steel proved stronger than Aztec faith. The temples were torn down. The priests were killed. The rituals were banned. And the world the Aztecs had fought so hard to sustain began to crumble. Yet the question remains, if you had been born into that world, if you had been raised to believe that your actions kept the sun in the sky, that your sacrifices kept the earth alive, could you have done it? Could you have stood on that temple, blade in hand, and taken a man's life, knowing that his death would save everything? Could you have eaten his flesh, not in hunger, but in reverence, believing that his sacrifice was the only thing standing between your people and the end of the world? The Aztecs could, and they did. Until the day their world ended, not because the gods abandoned them, but because a new god arrived, one who didn't demand blood, but souls. The Aztec world believed they are keeping the cosmos alive through ritual sacrifice. But in another part of the world, another ancient civilization discovered an even darker use for the human body, not to please the gods, but to terrify men. This is the story of how cannibalism became the ultimate weapon of psychological warfare. A calculated, cold-blooded tactic designed not just to kill an enemy, but to erase his legacy, crush his spirit, and send a message so horrifying it would echo across generations. Welcome to ancient China's Warring States period, a time of endless conflict, shifting alliances and ruthless ambition. 7 powerful states fought for total control. It was an era of brilliant military strategists and cruel tyrants, of Sun Tzu's The Art of War and real-world brutality that would eclipse any philosophy. In this world, victory wasn't enough. To ensure lasting dominance, you had to break your enemy's will completely. You had to attack not just his army, but his mind, his culture, his very soul. And nothing breaks a human soul like the violation of its deepest taboos. In the state of Qi, a powerful general achieved a significant victory. He captured his longtime rival, a noble commander from an opposing state. A simple execution would have been sufficient. But this general was not interested in simplicity. He was a student of human weakness, a connoisseur of fear. He wanted to craft a lesson so brutal, it would never be forgotten. He ordered his soldiers to take the body of his executed rival, not to a grave, but to the kitchen. The man was butchered, cooked, and prepared as a meal. Then the general summoned his special guest of honor, the dead man's son. Imagine the scene. The young man, shackled and grieving, is brought before the victorious general. He is offered food. He is, after all, a prisoner, hungry, defeated, and broken. For a moment, perhaps, his body betrays him with a primal hunger. Then comes the revelation. The source of the meat. This was not an act of random barbarism. It was a meticulously staged psychological operation. The general was forcing the son to participate in his own father obliteration, to become his father's tomb. In that moment, the general wasn't just killing a man. He was killing an entire lineage. This act struck at the very heart of ancient Chinese society, the sacred principle of xiao, or filial piety. Filial piety was the bedrock of culture, law, and personal identity. It was the duty to honor one's parents in life and to perform the proper rituals after their death to ensure their peaceful journey in the afterlife. By forcing the son to consume his father, the general violated this principle in the most profound way imaginable. He made the son the agent of his own father's eternal damnation. How could he ever perform the rites for a parent he had defiled? How could he ever seek revenge for a man he had, however unwillingly, consumed? The message was crystal clear. The son's spirit was shattered under the weight of unimaginable shame and eternal guilt. He was psychologically neutered, transformed from a potential vessel of revenge into a permanent monument to the general's power. But the audience was wider than just one broken man. This story was designed to travel. It spread through the courts and battlefields of the warring states like a poison. Who would dare oppose a man capable of such a thing? The general from Qi was no longer just a military leader. He was a force of nature, a demon of limitless cruelty. His legend became a weapon more powerful than any army. He had discovered that the most effective way to rule was not through love, or even through fear of death, but through the fear of something worse than death, complete and utter annihilation of the soul. This Chinese approach stands in stark contrast to the Aztec practice. For the Aztecs, cannibalism was part of a sacred covenant. The warrior who was consumed was honored, his strength passing to his captors in a cycle that sustained the universe. There was a twisted form of respect in the ritual. In China, there was only contempt. It was stripped of all spiritual meaning and weaponized into a tool of pure secular terror. It was the difference between a priest and a torturer. One killed for his gods, the other killed for his reputation. The story from Qi is not an isolated incident. History is littered with examples of cannibalism used as psychological terror. During the Roman Empire, it was said that the tyrant Emperor Vitellius forced a mother to dine on her own son as a display of his absolute power. In medieval Europe, sieges often led to starvation cannibalism, but sometimes the act was performed symbolically to demoralize the enemy within the walls. The message was always the same: your humanity means nothing. Your gods cannot save you. Your culture is powerless before me. This ancient tactic's legacy extends far into the modern world. While we don't see literal feasts on battlefields today, the principles of psychological warfare are more relevant than ever. Propaganda, misinformation, the desecration of cultural symbols, and the targeting of civilians are all modern extensions of the same dark logic employed by the general from Qi. The goal remains identical: to break the enemy's will to fight by attacking what they hold most sacred. To win not on the battlefield, but in the mind. The general from Qi understood something fundamental about human nature. He knew that culture is both a shield and a vulnerability. The very beliefs that bind a society together, like filial piety, can be twisted into the weapon that destroys it. He was a master of this dark alchemy, transforming sacred taboos into strategic assets. His story is a chilling lesson in the extremes of human conflict. It reminds us that war is not just a contest of strength, but a battle for the human mind. And in that battle, some are willing to cross any line, to violate any law of gods or men, to claim the most terrible victory of all. The genius of the Qi general's horrific strategy lay in its precision. He wasn't merely inflicting pain. He was surgically dismantling the very pillars of his enemy's identity. In a society built on Confucian principles, a person was not just an individual. They were a link in a chain of ancestors and descendants. To sever that chain was to commit a form of social and spiritual murder far more effective than any physical execution. The son, in the wake of his forced atrocity, was left in a state of existential ruin. His life as he knew it was over. He could never return to his homeland, for he carried an unforgivable pollution. He could never perform the ancestral rites, the most sacred duty of a son. How could he offer prayers to a father whose body he had consumed? In the eyes of his family, his community, and his own conscience, he was no longer a victim but an accomplice, a living, breathing monument to his lineage's desecration. His trauma was the general's masterpiece. It ensured he would never raise a sword in vengeance, for to do so would be to confront the unbearable truth of his own actions. He was neutralized not by a prison cell, but by a cage of his own shame. But the general's ambition reached far beyond breaking one man. He was playing a larger game of terror. The story of this event was not meant to be contained within his tent. It was designed to be whispered by fleeing soldiers, carried by traders, and discussed in horrified tones in the courts of rival kings. This weaponized rumor became his most powerful asset. Future enemies would now face him not just across a battlefield, but across a chasm of dread. They would know that defeat at his hands meant more than death. It meant the utter erasure of their name, the eternal suffering of their spirit, and the damnation of their heirs. This psychological edge was invaluable. It could cause armies to break ranks before the first arrow was loosed, and convince rival states to sue for humiliating peace rather than risk the unthinkable. The general had mastered a brutal economy of power. A single, horrific act could buy him years of uncontested dominance. This tactic of using cultural taboos as weapons was not unique to China, though its application there was particularly refined. The ancient Scythians, fierce nomadic warriors of the steppes, were known to drink the blood of their first slain enemy and fashion grisly trophies from the skulls of their most worthy opponents. The Assyrians famously carved reliefs depicting the flaying and impaling of their rebels, images meant to terrify subject peoples into submission. These acts, while not always involving cannibalism, served the same purpose: to demonstrate absolute dominance through the violation of the body and the humiliation of the spirit. They communicated a simple, terrifying message: your humanity is conditional on our mercy, and we have none. The Warring States period was also the era of Sun Tzu, and the general from Qi's actions can be seen as a monstrous, literal interpretation of the art of war's most famous tenet. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Sun Tzu wrote of attacking the enemy's strategy and alliances first. The Qi general attacked something even more fundamental: their cultural operating system. He understood that to truly subdue without fighting, you must make the enemy's culture a weapon against itself. By targeting filial piety, he wasn't just breaking a man, he was proving the impotence of the very beliefs that held his enemy's civilization together. This was strategic warfare, at its most devastatingly profound and cruel. The aftermath of such a psychological attack rippled outwards, causing long-term political shockwaves. The defeated state would be plunged into a crisis not just of leadership but of meaning. How could a society function when its core tenets had been so publicly and violently proven vulnerable? Alliances with other states would weaken, as others would fear being tainted by association with such a catastrophically defeated and spiritually polluted entity. The general's own state, meanwhile, would be seen as uniquely ruthless and powerful, attracting opportunistic allies and cowing potential rivals. The cost of opposing Qi was no longer measured in soldiers lost, but in souls destroyed. The general had rewritten the rules of engagement, and in doing so, had given his kingdom an aura of invincibility built on a foundation of pure terror. The chasm between the cannibalism of the Aztecs and that of the ancient Chinese strategists could not be wider. It represents the difference between sacred destruction and secular terror. The Aztec ritual was deeply embedded in a cosmic worldview. The victim was an Ixitla, a sacred impersonator of a god. His death was a necessary sacrifice to appease the deities and ensure the sun's rise. His flesh was consumed in an act of communion, a transfer of strength and honor. However brutal, it was an act of reverence and cosmic duty. The horror was in service of order. In stark contrast, the Chinese general's feast was an act of pure profanity. It was stripped of all divine context and elevated to a tool of statecraft. Its purpose was not to sustain the cosmos, but to dominate men. There was no reverence, only contempt. No honor, only humiliation. The victim was not a sacred offering, but a political message. This was not about feeding the gods. It was about feeding a reputation for such absolute, limitless ruthlessness that no one would ever dare challenge it again. One practice was meant to uphold the universe, the other to crush the human spirit. They stand as two distinct poles of the same dark human potential. The story from Qi is tragically far from an isolated case. History reveals a pattern of cannibalism being wielded as an instrument of terror by those seeking to cement their power through absolute fear. Centuries later, During the reign of the Sui dynasty, the tyrannical Emperor Yang was said to have forced a rebellious general to eat the flesh of his own son before having him executed. This act, echoing the same themes of perverted filial piety, shows the enduring appeal of this ultimate psychological weapon for tyrants. In medieval Europe, during the occasional brutal siege, defenders might hurling the bodies of their dead back at the attackers, not just as a practical measure, but as a grim tactic to demoralize the besieging force. These acts were designed to scream a single message: we are beyond the rules of humanity. Your conventions of war mean nothing here. The legacy of this ancient form of psychological warfare is not confined to the history books. Its core principles are alive and well in the modern world, albeit in evolved forms. While literal feasts are thankfully rare, the strategic goal of breaking an enemy's will by attacking their cultural and psychological core remains a cornerstone of conflict. Modern propaganda doesn't just spread lies. It seeks to erode national identity and morale. The desecration of cultural heritage sites, the use of prisoners for humiliating propaganda videos, and the targeting of religious symbols are all tactics designed to achieve the same effect as the Qi general's horrific meal. To demonstrate absolute dominance and to prove that the enemy's most deeply held beliefs are powerless to protect them. It is warfare aimed at the mind, and its roots stretch back to the earliest tyrants who understood that to truly conquer, you must first make your enemy despair. The tale of the general from Qi forces us to confront a deeply unsettling truth about power. These ancient masters of strategy discovered that the ultimate victory lies not in defeating an army, but in invading the soul of your enemy. It involves poisoning their cultural foundations, perverting their sacred traditions, and leaving a psychological wound so profound that it never heals. They understood that a society's greatest strengths, its shared beliefs, its rituals, its values, can be twisted into its most critical vulnerabilities. The general was a dark alchemist of human nature, transforming the sacred metal of filial piety into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. His story is more than a historical curiosity. It is a chilling lesson in the extremes of human conflict. It reminds us that war is and has always been a battle for the human mind. And in that brutal contest, some have always been willing to cross any line, to violate any law of gods or men, to achieve the most terrible victory of all, not just to win the war, but to ensure that no one would ever dare to wage it again. The echo of that message, sent centuries ago from a tent in ancient China, still resonates in the darkest corners of human conflict today. The story of the Chinese general is a masterclass in psychological terror, a chilling example of cannibalism, weaponized for secular power. But to view these acts solely through the lens of strategy or sadism is to miss a deeper, more universal thread running through human history. Across continents and millennia, separated by oceans and ignorant of each other's existence, cultures arrived at the same profound and unsettling conclusion, that to consume a person is to consume their essence. This is not about hunger. It is about a fundamental belief in the transfer of power, a concept anthropologists call consumptive assimilation. It is the idea that by ingesting the flesh of another being, you can incorporate their strength, their courage, their wisdom, or even their very soul. Before it was a weapon, it was a philosophy. Before it was an insult, it was an aspiration. This chapter zooms out from the battlefields of China and the temples of Tenochtitlan to explore this global phenomenon, the deep-seated belief system that forms the philosophical bedrock for the very practice of ritual cannibalism. To understand this, we must step into a worldview utterly different from our modern scientific one. For many ancient and indigenous cultures, the universe was not an empty space filled with separate objects, but a vibrant web of interconnected forces and energies. Power was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible substance that flowed through people, animals, and the land itself. A great warrior was not just skilled. He was literally filled with a potent energy of combat. A wise elder did not just have knowledge. She contained the essence of wisdom itself. And when such a person died, that power did not simply vanish into nothingness. It remained lingering in the body, a precious and potent resource that could be lost or claimed. This belief system transforms the act of eating from mere sustenance into a sacred transaction. It becomes a form of communion far more literal than any modern metaphor. If strength resides in the muscle and sinew of a powerful warrior, then consuming that muscle is to directly ingest and absorb his strength. If courage resides in the heart, then eating the heart is to make that courage your own. This is the core of consumptive assimilation, the literal belief that you are what you eat, in the most profound spiritual sense imaginable. It is a concept that explains the Aztec practice with a new clarity. The captive warrior was not just a sacrifice. He was a vessel of Tonali, the animating force of the sun. By consuming his flesh, the captor and his family were not merely celebrating. They were recycling that solar energy, absorbing the warrior's vigor and returning it to the cosmic cycle. It was, in their eyes, the ultimate recycling program. This belief was not confined to the Aztecs. It flourished independently across the globe, a testament to a shared human intuition about the nature of power and the body. In the dense rainforests of South America, numerous tribes practiced forms of endo-cannibalism, the consumption of members of one's own group. When a revered elder or a beloved family member died, their body was not buried to be consumed by worms. It was cremated or cooked, and the ashes or flesh were consumed by their kin. This was not an act of desperation, but one of profound love and respect. The goal was to keep the deceased within the community, quite literally. To ingest their bones was to preserve their wisdom and their spirit within the living bodies of their descendants, ensuring their memory and influence would guide the tribe for generations. It was the opposite of erasure. It was eternal incorporation. The body was not a prison for the soul, but its repository, and consuming it was the surest way to prevent that soul from being lost forever. Yet, this same fundamental belief could be turned outward, toward the enemy, with dramatically different intentions. While consuming your own was an act of love and preservation, consuming your foe was often an act of conquest and appropriation. This is where we encounter the fierce headhunting cultures of the Celts in ancient Europe. For a Celtic warrior, the head was the seat of the soul, the repository of a person's power and identity. To take a head in battle was not just to collect a trophy, it was to capture the very essence of a worthy opponent. These heads were often displayed prominently, not merely to boast, but to harness the power of the vanquished warrior, to add his strength to the community, and to intimidate future enemies by showcasing the collected power now arrayed against them. It was a different form of consumption, one of display rather than digestion, but it sprang from the same belief that the power of a person could be physically captured and owned. This dichotomy between consuming the revered insider and the hated outsider reveals the two faces of the same deep-seated belief. One is about love, memory, and internal continuity. The other is about domination, theft, and external power. Both, however, are rooted in the unwavering conviction that the self is not a closed system, that the boundaries of the body are permeable, and that the qualities that make a person great are a substance that can be transferred one way or another, from them to you. If the consumption of a loved one was a sacred duty, and the consumption of a worthy enemy was a strategic acquisition, then there exists a third, even darker permutation of this belief, its use for pure malevolent sorcery. This is where consumptive assimilation moves from the community altar and the battlefield into the shadowy realm of the secret society and the witch doctor's hut. Here the act is stripped of any honor or communal benefit and is instead focused on the individual's selfish acquisition of power, regardless of the cosmic cost. The most infamous example of this is the legendary Leopard Society of West and Central Africa. Operating primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries in regions spanning Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the Congo, the Leopard Society was a secretive men's association that wielded immense social and political power through fear. Their name came from their gruesome signature. They would maul their victims using weapons fashioned to look like leopard claws and teeth, making it appear as if the attack was the work of a wild animal. But their true purpose was far more sinister than simple murder. They believed that by consuming the flesh of their victims, particularly their hearts and livers, they could absorb their life force, their vitality, and their strength. This was not about absorbing a warrior's courage. It was about stealing the very essence of any human being to augment one's own power, achieve political goals, or simply instill a paralyzing fear that allowed the society to control villages and trade routes. The Leopard Society perverted the ancient belief into a tool of terrorism and personal gain, demonstrating how a spiritual concept could be twisted into a nightmare of pure predation. This belief in the stealing of essence through consumption also manifested in more symbolic, but equally potent ways across other cultures. In parts of Melanesia, for instance, warriors might consume a tiny fragment of a powerful enemy, a piece of his heart or his eye, not to become full of his flesh, but to capture a specific quality he possessed. It was a targeted ritualistic act of assimilation. Similarly, some Native American tribes were known to ritually consume strips of flesh from their own arms or legs during mourning ceremonies, a poignant act of auto-cannibalism that symbolized the internalization of their grief and their connection to the departed. The variety of these practices is vast, but the underlying principle remains astonishingly consistent. The body and spirit are not separate. To interact with one is to affect the other. This universal belief system did not emerge from a vacuum. It provided profound psychological and social functions for the cultures that held it. For communities living with high mortality rates and the constant threat of annihilation, the practice of endo-cannibalism was a powerful mechanism for coping with grief and loss. Rather than surrendering a loved one entirely to the decay of the earth, they kept them close, transforming the agony of separation into a continued physical bond. It was a way of denying death its final victory. Conversely, the exo-cannibalism of warfare, eating a powerful enemy, was the ultimate expression of victory. It was the complete and total negation of the enemy's threat. You hadn't just killed him, you had digested him. You had taken his power and made it your own, ensuring he could never challenge you again, even in spirit. It was the absolute form of conquest. Furthermore, these practices served as powerful social glue. A shared ritual meal of a revered elder's remains reinforced kinship bonds and collective identity in a way a simple burial never could. The entire community literally shared the same ancestor, becoming one body in a deeply literal sense. The successful headhunt, whose trophies were displayed for the village, was a communal asset, a source of collective pride and spiritual security. The belief in consumptive assimilation, therefore, was not a bizarre aberration of human thought. It was a coherent, logical, and deeply functional system for understanding life, death, power, and community. It provided answers to the most terrifying questions of existence and offered a sense of control in a dangerous and unpredictable world. It was for them a science of the soul. When we place the actions of the Chinese general, the Aztec priest, and the Celtic headhunter side by side on this anthropological canvas, their practices, though outwardly different, suddenly reveal a shared foundational logic. They are all variations on the same profound human theme, the desire to acquire and control power through the physical incorporation of another's essence. The differences lie not in the core belief, but in the target of the consumption and the intention behind it. We can see these acts on a spectrum. On one end lies reverential consumption, the consumption of a loved one or a revered elder to preserve their wisdom and keep their spirit within the community. This is an act of love, continuity, and internal strengthening. The South American endo-cannibalistic tribes sit firmly here. On the opposite end lies predatory consumption, the consumption of a victim solely for the selfish malevolent acquisition of power, with no honor for the consumed and no benefit for the wider community, beyond terror. The leopard society is the purest example of this dark extreme. Most historical cases of ritual cannibalism, however, lie somewhere in the complex middle ground between these two poles. The Aztec practice is a fascinating hybrid. The captive warrior was an enemy, yet he was treated with immense honor and respect, called a precious brother, and given a place of reverence before his death. His consumption was not an act of hatred, but one of sacred duty that benefited the entire cosmos. He was an outsider treated as an insider for a higher purpose. The Celtic headhunter also occupies this middle ground. The enemy was respected for his power, which is why that power was worth stealing. His head was displayed as a trophy of conquest, but also as a revered object containing a powerful spirit that could now protect the village. The Chinese general, however, pushes the practice to the far predatory end of the spectrum. His act contained no reverence, no respect, and no sense of a higher cosmic duty. The consumption was not about absorbing his enemy's strength. It was about forcing the son to desecrate his father's memory. It was a calculated perversion of the ancient belief, using its psychological weight not for acquisition, but for pure, unadulterated terror. He understood the power of the taboo so well that he could weaponize it without believing in its spiritual truth. This perhaps marks the most cynical evolution of the practice, using a sacred belief as a blunt instrument of psychological torture. The legacy of this ancient belief in consumptive assimilation is far more pervasive than we might think. While literal cannibalism has faded, the metaphors we live by are steeped in this old intuition. We devour a book we love, seeking to ingest its knowledge. We say a powerful performer commanded the stage, or that a charismatic person has a magnetic energy. Speaking of power as a tangible force. In our darkest times, we speak of being consumed by grief or anger, giving emotional states a physical, devouring quality. These are linguistic ghosts of a time when the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was far more porous. Understanding this deep anthropological bedrock is crucial. It allows us to see the acts of the Aztec, the Chinese general, and the Celtic warrior not as random atrocities or mere savagery, but as logical extensions of a coherent, if foreign, worldview. They were not insane. They were operating on a different set of principles about how the universe functions. They believed power was a substance to be transferred, and they developed rituals to manage that transfer. This doesn't make the practices any less brutal to modernize, but it makes them comprehensible. It transforms them from senseless horror into a profound, if terrifying, human attempt to understand the nature of life, death, and what makes one person powerful and another weak. It reveals that the desire to capture the strength of kings, both literal and metaphorical, is a story written deep into the human psyche, a dark and enduring testament to our endless quest for power. The anthropological belief in consumptive assimilation provided a framework, a spiritual logic that made cannibalism understandable, if not acceptable, to the modern mind. It was a practice with rules, however brutal, a dreadful contract between the living, the dead, and the gods. But history shows us that any belief, no matter how structured, can be perverted. Any tool, no matter how sacred, can be seized by the wrong hands and twisted into an instrument of pure personal evil. This is the story of that perversion. This chapter moves from the collective rituals of cultures to the private dining hall of a single corrupted individual. We journey to the twilight of the Sui dynasty in China, to the court of one of history's most infamous tyrants, Emperor Yang. His story represents the dark evolution of ritual cannibalism, a journey from the sacred and the strategic into the abyss of personal vengeance and unrestrained sadism. This is what happens when the Conqueror's banquet is no longer for the gods or even for the state, but for the pleasure of one man. Emperor Yangguang ascended to the dragon throne in 604 AD, and his reign began, like so many others, with promise and ambition. He inherited an empire recently unified by his father, Emperor Wen, a hard-working and frugal ruler who had restored order after centuries of fragmentation. Yang Guang was a man of immense energy and grandiose vision. He extended the Grand Canal, a staggering feat of engineering that connected the north and south of China, and he patronized the arts and Buddhism. But beneath this veneer of cultured leadership festered a profound megalomania and a bottomless capacity for cruelty. His ambitions were not for the people, but for his own glory. The Grand Canal, while ultimately beneficial for centuries to come, was built at a horrifying human cost, with millions of conscripted laborers dying under the whips of his overseers. He launched disastrously expensive campaigns against Korea, draining the treasury and breaking the backs of the peasantry with taxes and conscription. His was a reign of breathtaking projects and breathtaking brutality, each feeding the other. As his failures mounted and his people's suffering deepened, the inevitable occurred: rebellion. Dissent simmered across the empire, but it coalesced into a particularly potent threat under a general named Yang Shuanggan. Yang Shuanggan was not some common bandit. He was from a powerful aristocratic family, a man of high rank and education, who had once been a trusted member of the emperor's own court. His betrayal was not just a military challenge, it was a personal and profound insult to Emperor Yang. It was a rejection from within his own elite circle, a signal that his own class was turning against him. The emperor's armies eventually crushed the rebellion, and Yang Shuanggan was killed in battle. But for a man like Emperor Yang, a mere military victory was insufficient. The rebellion had been a personal slight, and the response would be a personal punishment. The general's death had robbed the emperor of the chance to make an example of him personally. But there were other ways to exact a price, other ways to stage a lesson in absolute power. The rebellion may have been crushed, but the emperor's vengeance was just beginning. The focus of his wrath now turned to the captured lieutenants of the rebellion and, most importantly, to Yang Shuanggan's family and associates. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of individuals were rounded up. Their fate was not to be a simple execution. Emperor Yang devised a punishment that would be remembered with horror for 1,000 years. He ordered a great banquet to be held. The invited guests were his loyal courtiers, the officials who had remained obedient. The mood was not one of celebration, but of terror and forced compliance. The court knew the emperor's temper. They knew his capacity for cruelty. They filed into the hall, their eyes avoiding each other, dreading what was to come. The emperor presided, his expression undoubtedly one of cold satisfaction. This was not just a meal. It was a performance of his absolute authority, and every person in the room was both audience and potential participant. Then the dishes were served. The platters were carried in, bearing what appeared to be roasted meats. But the air did not hold the familiar, comforting aroma of a feast. A tension, a dread hung over the tables. The emperor then made his announcement. He revealed the source of the meat. This was not pork or lamb. This was the flesh of the executed rebels. The body of Yang Shuanggan himself had been exhumed and butchered. His remains and those of his key followers had been prepared in the imperial kitchens and were now being presented to his former peers. The message was not for the dead. It was for the living. The emperor was forcing his own court, the very pillars of his regime, to partake in the ultimate desecration. They were to become accomplices. By eating the flesh of the rebels, they were symbolically consuming the rebellion itself, internalizing the emperor's victory and demonstrating their utter submission to his will. It was an act designed to shatter the last vestiges of aristocratic solidarity and ensure that the thought of rebellion would never again cross the mind of any nobleman. The cost of defiance was no longer just your own life. It was the annihilation of your very body and the forced complicity of everyone you ever knew. The banquet orchestrated by Emperor Yang was a masterpiece of psychological tyranny, but its true horror lies in its deviation from any known historical precedent. This was not the Aztec ritual. where consumption was a sacred duty to nourish the gods. This was not the strategy of the Qi general. A brutal but calculated act of terrorism aimed at demoralizing external enemies. And this was far removed from the anthropological belief in consumptive assimilation, where one eats a powerful foe to absorb his strength. Emperor Yang was not seeking to absorb the strength of Yang Xuangan. He was seeking to erase him. He was not performing a duty to the cosmos. He was indulging a personal vendetta. This act represents a fundamental shift, the descent of ritual cannibalism from a practice with a communal, spiritual, or strategic purpose into a theater of pure sadism. We can analyze this shift through three distinct lenses. First, the target of the ritual. For the Aztecs, the ritual was for Huitzilopochtli. For the Qi general, the message was for the enemy's son and future opponents. For Emperor Yang, the audience was his own court. He was not communicating with gods or enemies. He was terrorizing his own supporters. This is a hallmark of the paranoid tyrant, the belief that even one's closest allies are potential traitors who must be broken and remade through fear. The act was designed to dissolve all bonds of loyalty and friendship among the elite, ensuring the only relationship that mattered was the vertical one of total submission to the emperor. Second, the nature of the consumption. There is no historical evidence that Emperor Yang himself ate the flesh of the rebels. This is a critical and chilling distinction. He presided. He watched. He forced others to consume. This transforms the act from participation to voyeuristic domination. The pleasure for Yang was not in the ingestion of power, but in the act of coercion itself. He derived satisfaction from watching the horror and revulsion on the faces of his courtiers, from seeing them overcome their deepest taboos at his command. This is the essence of sadism, the enjoyment of the psychological suffering of others. The meal was not about fuel or magic. It was about the demonstration of his power to compel absolute degradation. Finally, the fate of the body. The Aztecs and the practitioners of consumptive assimilation treated the body with a degree of ritual respect. It was a sacred vessel. The Qi general used the body as a message. Emperor Yang treated the body as refuse to be defiled. The exhumation of Yang Xuangan's corpse is particularly significant. It was not enough to kill him. His body had to be violated posthumously, denied rest, and turned into a tool for the humiliation of his family and allies. This goes beyond strategic messaging into the realm of personal spite and vengeance that extends beyond the grave. It is an attempt to annihilate a person's memory and legacy so completely that not even their physical remains are left with dignity. The immediate aftermath of the banquet was a court plunged into silent, paralyzing fear. The noblemen who had been forced to participate carried a permanent stain, a psychological trauma that bound them to the emperor through shared guilt and horror. They could never speak out against him, for they were now complicit in his atrocity. Any dissent would require them to first confront their own actions at that table. For the families of the rebels, the punishment was ongoing. Their loved ones had been denied an ancestral burial, their spirits condemned to wander without peace, and their name was now synonymous with a horror so great it was literally consumed by the court. Emperor Yang had in his mind secured his power, but he had also revealed the rotten core of his reign. He had proven that his authority was based not on merit, destiny, or the mandate of heaven, but on the sheer unrestrained capacity to inflict horror. He had become a monster, and his court now knew it. The banquet did not cement his dynasty. It revealed its fundamental illegitimacy and moral bankruptcy, hastening the rebellions that would eventually bring it down. While Emperor Yang's story is a stark example of cannibalism's descent into tyranny, he was not alone in history. His actions find a dark mirror in the legends of Central Africa, particularly in the stories surrounding figures like King Takab of Kukue. These tales, passed down through oral tradition and recorded by colonial administrators and missionaries, speak of rulers who used cannibalism not for ritualistic purposes, but as an expression of ultimate personal power and cruelty. King Takab was said to maintain a private execution ground and a personal chef, whose grim duty was to prepare the bodies of his victims for his consumption. His reasons were not spiritual. They were rooted in a belief that consuming his enemies, particularly powerful warriors or beautiful young women, would transfer their strength or vitality directly to him. This is consumptive assimilation, stripped of its communal value and reduced to a personal superstition, a dark magic for a single user's benefit. The parallel with Emperor Yang is clear. The shift from a practice that served a collective purpose, however grim, to one that served only the ego and appetites of a single, omnipotent individual. The stories of Yang and Takab represent the final, logical endpoint of the Conqueror's Banquet. When divorced from the strict doctrines of religion, the strategic calculations of warfare, or the cohesive bonds of anthropology, the act of cannibalistic vengeance becomes untethered from any constraint. It becomes a blank canvas for the worst human impulses: paranoia, sadism, megalomania, and the sheer enjoyment of absolute power over others. It is no longer about sending a message to outsiders. It is about the tyrant's internal world, his personal demons and insecurities, played out on the bodies of his subjects. The table becomes an altar not to a god, but to the self. The legacy of such tyrants is a warning about the nature of absolute power. Their stories show that the human capacity for cruelty is not static. It can evolve, finding new and more horrific expressions as it is given license. The tools of terror are refined over time. Emperor Yang did not invent political cannibalism. He refined it into a more psychologically complex and personally gratifying form of oppression. He understood that the deepest form of control is not just over life and death, but over the human spirit, forcing people to betray their most deeply held beliefs, to become active participants in their own moral degradation. This is a form of power that seeks not just obedience, but the complete dismantling of the self. Ultimately, the stories of these tyrants force us to confront a difficult question. The Aztec priest, the Chi general, even the headhunter. They can be understood if not condoned within their cultural contexts. Their actions had an internal logic. But what of Emperor Yang? What of King Takab? Their actions seem to defy understanding. They feel like a descent into a madness that is both personal and absolute. Yet perhaps they are not an aberration, but a reflection. They represent the potential that lurks when power is unchecked by morality, tradition, or empathy. They are the dark echo of the ancient rituals, proving that any practice, no matter how sacred its origins, can be corrupted into a theater of cruelty. The Conqueror's Banquet, in the end, is not about the food that is served, but about the hunger of the one who presides over it, a hunger for domination so vast and insatiable that it can only be expressed by consuming the world itself, one person at a time. For centuries, the practices of consumptive assimilation and ritualized cannibalism existed within their own cultural ecosystems, their logic understood by participants and onlookers alike. But history is filled with moments of violent collision, when one world suddenly and often brutally crashes into another. The story of ritual cannibalism is incomplete without the voices of those outsiders who stumbled upon it, men who witnessed these acts not through a lens of understanding, but through one of sheer unadulterated horror. Their accounts, dripping with revulsion and disbelief, are a powerful narrative tool. They humanize the shock of first contact and reveal a crucial truth. The perception of cannibalism has been, for centuries, the ultimate line in the sand between the civilized and the savage. This chapter is told through their eyes: the conquistador, the explorer, the colonial administrator. Their reports did more than just record. They justified empires, fueled prejudices, and shaped the Western world's view of indigenous cultures for generations. They are deeply biased, politically motivated, and often factually questionable. And yet, they are irreplaceable. for they capture the raw, unfiltered moment when two irreconcilable worlds met. The most iconic of these witnesses are the Spanish conquistadors in Mesoamerica. Men like Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Hernán Cortés's army, left detailed chronicles of their campaigns. Diaz's account of entering the Aztec city of Tlatelolco, adjacent to Tenochtitlan, is a masterpiece of cultural shock. He describes the Tzompantli, the great rack of skulls, with a numb horror. The skulls were placed on one side and the other of the stakes, and one could not count them, for they were innumerable. But it was the temples that truly sealed his perception of the Aztecs as practitioners of something demonic. He describes the priests with their hair matted with blood, the stench of death, and the idols adorned with hearts and blood. While Diaz may not have witnessed a full act of ritual consumption himself, the surrounding evidence, the skulls, the blood-soaked temples, the tales of captives and sacrifices, painted a picture so vivid and terrifying that it confirmed every European fear of the godless native. Another chronicler, Francisco López de Gómara, wrote more explicitly, describing how the flesh of sacrificed captives was eaten in a stew with maize, a detail that would have seemed particularly barbaric and perverse to a European palate. For these men, this was not a complex cosmological ritual. It was proof of Satan's work in the New World. Their revulsion was genuine, but it was also immediately useful. It provided the moral and religious justification for the conquest that was already underway. How could the destruction of such a culture be a sin? It was, in their eyes, a holy duty. This pattern repeated itself centuries later in the heart of Africa. As European explorers like Henry Morton Stanley pushed into the Congo River basin in the late 19th century, they carried with them the same template of shock and justification. Their mission was different, commercial and philanthropic under the guise of King Leopold II of Belgium's Congo Free State. But their rhetoric was strikingly similar. They encountered practices of ritual cannibalism among certain groups, often related to warfare or funerary rites, and reported them with a mixture of lurid fascination and moral outrage. Their accounts, published in books and newspapers back in Europe, were devoured by a public eager for tales of exotic adventure. They described, often in sensationalized detail, cannibal feasts and orgies of blood. These reports were not neutral observations. They were powerful propaganda. They served to dehumanize the entire Congolese population, framing them as subhuman savages in desperate need of the civilizing influence of European rule. This perceived barbarism was used to justify unspeakable atrocities, forced labor, mutilation, and genocide, committed by the very colonizers who claimed to be ending it. The horror of the witness became the rationale for a far greater, more systematic horror. Even the ancient Romans, themselves no strangers to spectacular violence in the arena, used accounts of cannibalism to define the boundaries of their own civilization. The historian Tacitus, writing about the Germanic tribes, occasionally mentions tribes like the infamous horse-eaters or others who were rumored to practice ritual cannibalism. For Tacitus, this served a literary and political purpose. By describing the practices of the barbarians beyond the Rhine and Danube, he was holding up a dark mirror to Roman society. These accounts, whether entirely accurate or exaggerated, reinforced Roman identity. We are the ones who dine on couches with refined manners. They are the ones who consume human flesh in dark forests. It was a way of marking the geographical and moral frontier of the civilized world. The disgust was real, but it was also a carefully cultivated tool to reinforce a sense of cultural and racial superiority. To use these accounts as simple historical fact is to fall into the same trap as the colonizers. The writings of the conquistadors, explorers, and even Roman historians are fraught with problems. Their bias is immense. They were often writing to glorify themselves, to justify conquest, to secure funding from their patrons, or to sell books to a sensation-hungry public. They frequently misunderstood what they were seeing, interpreting complex rituals through a lens of Christian morality and European superiority. They had a vested interest in exaggerating the savagery of the people they sought to dominate. The more monstrous the native, the more heroic the conqueror. Their descriptions of cannibal feasts might have been based on a single misconstrued event, or even outright fabrication. They rarely, if ever, sought to understand the internal logic of the practices they described. The Aztec cycle of cosmic renewal was invisible to them. They saw only devil worship. And yet, despite this immense bias, these sources hold a kernel of invaluable truth. They are records of a profound and visceral human reaction. The conquistadors discussed at the Tzompantli is a genuine human emotion. The fear of the European explorer in the Congo, surrounded by a culture whose practices were utterly alien and terrifying to him, is authentic. This raw emotional response is itself a historical fact. It tells us less about the Aztecs or the Congolese, and more about the mindset of the Europeans and the colossal chasm of understanding that separated these cultures. These accounts capture the moment of collision in all its terrifying confusion. They are a testament to the power of cultural difference to generate sheer uncomprehending horror. Furthermore, the very fact that these reports were so widely used and believed reveals a crucial truth about the mechanics of power. The accusation of cannibalism became the ultimate weapon of propaganda. It was the silver bullet of dehumanization. To label a people as cannibals was to place them outside the family of mankind, to strip them of any rights and to justify any action taken against them. It was the moral prelude to genocide and subjugation. The Spanish used it to justify the encomienda system and the destruction of indigenous temples. The Belgians used it to justify the rubber terror in the Congo. The charge of cannibalism allowed the colonizer to frame himself not as a murderer and a thief, but as a missionary and a civilizer, no matter how brutal his methods. The legacy of these witnesses is a complicated one. They left us a record, however flawed, of practices that the practitioners themselves often did not write down. Without Díaz del Castillo, our understanding of the Aztec world would be poorer. But they also left a legacy of profound racism and misunderstanding that continues to shape perceptions of indigenous cultures to this day. The stereotype of the savage cannibal is one of the most enduring and damaging images from the colonial era. Separating the reality of the practice from the horror of the witness is one of history's greatest challenges. We must read these accounts with a critical eye, acknowledging their bias while also acknowledging the powerful human emotion they contain. They remind us that the story of cannibalism is not just about those who practiced it, but about those who witnessed it, and how their shock and revulsion were harnessed to build and justify empires on a foundation of blood and bones. The witness, in the end, often became the executioner, armed with the pen and the sword, and convinced of his own righteous civilization. For millennia, the ritual consumption of human flesh existed on a spectrum, from the sacred to the strategic to the sadistic. It was, in its various forms, an accepted, if extreme, part of the human story. But then across the globe, a great shift occurred. The practice did not merely fade. It was actively suppressed, outlawed, and driven into the darkest corners of the world and human behavior. The Conqueror's banquet was, slowly and irrevocably, forbidden. This decline was not the result of a single event, but a confluence of powerful forces that reshaped human societies. The spread of universal religions with strict new moral codes, the rise of centralized empires with professional armies, and the accelerating interconnectedness of the world through trade and exploration all conspired to make public, institutionalized cannibalism not just taboo, but a political and diplomatic liability. This chapter tracks the death of a practice, exploring how the world changed to make the ultimate act of power into the ultimate crime. The most profound force in this decline was the relentless expansion of the great universalizing religions: Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Each of these faiths, in their own way, erected a powerful theological barrier against the consumption of human flesh. For Christianity, the body was a temple of the Holy Spirit and was sacred, destined for resurrection. To consume it was a defilement of God's creation and a violation of divine law, an act associated with the ultimate sinners and the devil himself. Islam's dietary laws laid out in the Quran were exceptionally clear and strict. The prohibition of pork was absolute, but the prohibition of human flesh was so fundamental it was often unstated, a given of such basic humanity that it needed no elaboration. It was the ultimate haram, forbidden. Buddhism, with its core tenets of non-violence, ahimsa, and compassion for all living beings, inherently condemned an act rooted in violence and the ultimate disrespect for the sanctity of life. These were not merely suggestions for personal conduct. They were the foundational laws for new civilizations. As these religions spread through conquest, conversion, and trade, they brought their taboos with them, layering them over existing indigenous beliefs. A local practice of endo-cannibalism to honor ancestors might be tolerated for a time by missionary priests, but it was always marked for eventual eradication as a pagan holdover. A warrior's ritual consumption of a foe's heart was no longer an act of power. It was a sin that jeopardized one's immortal soul. The new religious authorities had the power to enforce these views, often with brutal efficiency. The framework of meaning that had justified these practices for centuries, the recycling of cosmic energy, the absorption of an enemy's strength, was systematically dismantled and replaced with a new, uncompromising moral absolute. This is evil. Alongside this religious revolution came a political one, the consolidation of large, centralized empires. The warring states of China gave way to the unified Qin and Han dynasties. The feuding tribes of Europe were gradually subsumed into kingdoms and eventually nation-states. This shift from fractured territories to vast empires demanded a new kind of control. Warfare could no longer be a personal affair of vengeance between chieftains. It became a tool of state policy, managed by bureaucrats and fought by professional standing armies. The random, ritualized brutality of a lone general, forcing a son to eat his father's flesh, was a liability to a large empire. It could incite uncontrollable rebellions, disrupt delicate diplomatic relations with neighboring powers, and undermine the state's desired image of orderly, rational, and superior civilization. Emperor Yang's horrific banquet was not just an act of cruelty. It was a failure of statecraft that contributed to the downfall of his dynasty. The new imperial model required soldiers who followed a chain of command, not individualistic warriors pursuing personal glory or spiritual gain through acts that the central state now viewed as barbaric and destabilizing. The state monopolized violence, and it preferred that violence to be clean, efficient, and above all, accountable to the throne, not to the whims of a bloodthirsty general or the dictates of an old religion. The final nail in the coffin for public ritual. Cannibalism was the age of exploration, and the resulting increase in global contact. As European ships began connecting every continent, practices that were once isolated became global news. The accounts of witnesses, the conquistadors, the missionaries, the traders, flooded back to Europe, creating a unified front of horror and revulsion. This had a dual effect. First, it solidified the civilized versus savage paradigm that justified colonialism. But second, and just as importantly, it made cannibalism a massive diplomatic and reputational problem. A kingdom that wanted to trade with European powers, acquire their guns, or avoid being colonized itself, now had to conform to European norms. To be labeled a cannibal kingdom was to be marked for conquest or isolation. The pressure to abandon such practices, whether through the barrel of a gun or the persuasive power of lost trade opportunities, became immense. The practice that was once a display of power was now a mark of backwardness that invited subjugation. Yet the practice did not vanish entirely. It did not so much die as it was driven underground. It persisted, and in some cases still persists, in the most isolated regions of the world. The remote jungles of the Amazon, the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the deepest interior of Borneo. In these places, cut off from the forces of globalization and state control, the old beliefs held sway for much longer. Even here, however, change was inevitable. The arrival of missionaries, anthropologists, and government officials throughout the 20th century placed immense pressure on these communities. What was once a public ritual became a secret one. The practice transformed from a celebrated community event to a much rarer, more furtive act, often linked to ongoing tribal warfare or shamanistic practices kept hidden from outsiders. The meaning began to change too, often stripped of its broader cosmological significance and reduced to a more focused, and often more desperate, form of magic, a way to curse an enemy or gain power in a world that was rapidly closing in around them. The decline of institutionalized cannibalism represents a monumental shift in human history. It marks the point where a once widespread practice was reclassified as the ultimate transgression. This was not a natural evolution of morality, but a forced one, imposed by the spread of new religions, the power of consolidated states, and the pressure of an interconnected world. The end of the practice created a new global consensus, a line that virtually every society eventually agreed not to cross. But this consensus came at a cost. It was often achieved through violence, coercion, and the erasure of cultural identities. The understanding of the complex beliefs that underpinned these practices was lost, replaced by a simplistic label of savagery. We were left with the taboo, but we lost the context. The world became in some ways less brutal, but it also became less complex. The forbidden practice leaves behind a complicated legacy, a victory for a certain universal morality, but a victory won through the often bloody imposition of one culture's norms upon another, silencing ancient rituals and closing a dark, fascinating, and deeply human chapter of our collective past. The grand rituals have faded. The tyrannical feasts are confined to the history books. The practice of consumptive assimilation has been driven to the very edges of the modern world, and yet the power of the act has not diminished. It has simply shape-shifted, moving from the literal to the metaphorical, from the battlefield to the psyche. Cannibalism did not disappear. It went underground into the very language we use and the stories we tell. It remains the ultimate benchmark of horror, the line whose crossing defines the absolute monster. Even as we have ostensibly civilized ourselves, the ancient, visceral terror of consuming our own kind continues to haunt us, revealing itself in our metaphors for greed, our fascination with serial killers, and our complex judgment of those who cross the line merely to survive. This chapter explores the ghost of the Conqueror's Banquet, and how its shadow still looms large over the modern world. Our language is a fossil record of our deepest fears and obsessions, and nowhere is this more evident than in our relentless use of cannibalistic imagery to describe insatiable hunger. We speak of corporations as cannibalizing their own markets, of a war consuming a generation of young men, of capitalism devouring itself. Their particularly ruthless business takeover is described as a feeding frenzy. We devour a good book, digest information, and find a powerful performance riveting, a word whose root means to tear apart. These are not accidental metaphors. They are a linguistic testament to the fact that we understand consumption as the most fundamental and most terrifying form of power. To be consumed is to cease to exist, to be absorbed into something else. These metaphors carry the echo of the Aztec belief in the recycling of energy and the Chi general's goal of utter annihilation. They reveal that on some subconscious level, we still view the world through the ancient lens of consumptive assimilation, where power is gained by literally incorporating the other. The modern conqueror no longer eats his enemy's flesh. He eats his company, his resources, his market share. The plate and fork have been replaced by the contract and the stock ticker. but the underlying hunger remains eerily familiar. If our metaphors reveal a subconscious understanding, then our modern legends reveal our outright terror. The figure of the cannibal serial killer has become a staple of horror films, crime novels, and news reports, representing the absolute apex of human evil. Figures like Jeffrey Dahmer, or fictional monsters like Hannibal Lecter, are not portrayed as merely murderous. They are presented as something beyond the pale, a unique category of monster who violates the one taboo that truly separates humanity from the beast. Their cannibalism is not presented as a cultural practice or a strategic act. It is the ultimate expression of personal deviance, a psychosexual pathology that marks them as subhuman. This modern archetype is the direct descendant of the colonial tales of savage cannibals, but with a crucial difference. The monster is no longer an outsider from a distant land. He is the neighbor next door, the quiet man in the apartment downstairs. This makes the terror even more potent. The horror lies in the revelation that the ultimate savage lurks not in a jungle, but within our own civilized society. A wolf in human skin. The cannibal killer is the embodiment of our fear that the thin veneer of civilization is just that, a veneer, and that the ancient primal hunger can erupt at any time, in the most familiar of places. This deep-seated taboo is perhaps most powerfully tested, not in the acts of monsters, but in the desperate choices of ordinary people facing certain death. The story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, which crashed in the Andes in 1972, provides the clearest modern window into the raw power of this ancient prohibition. Facing starvation, freezing temperatures, and hopeless isolation, the survivors made the agonizing decision to consume the bodies of the dead to stay alive. Their story, immortalized in books and film, is not one of horror but of heartbreaking necessity and profound moral conflict. They argued with themselves, citing Catholic doctrine, and ultimately framed the act not as a desecration, but as a form of holy communion, a way for the souls of their friends to give them the strength to live. This was survival cannibalism in its purest form, utterly divorced from ritual, strategy, or malice. Yet when the survivors were finally rescued and their story emerged, the world's reaction was telling. While many were sympathetic, the public and media frenzy was dominated by a visceral sense of shock and revulsion. The headline of a Chilean newspaper screamed, "They ate my son." The survivors were met with a mixture of awe and horror. This reaction proves that the taboo is not a relic. It is a living, powerful force within us. Even when the act is justified, even when it is the only rational choice, it still feels like a transgression of a fundamental law of nature. The Andes survivors were not condemned as criminals, but they were forever marked by their ordeal, their identities inextricably linked to the ultimate act of survival. Their story shows that even when the mind rationally accepts the necessity, the human spirit still recoils at the act. The ancient taboo, installed by millennia of religion, culture, and law, remains one of the strongest psychological barriers we possess. The journey of cannibalism through human history is a journey from the literal to the metaphorical, from the communal to the personal, from the sacred to the profane. We have largely abandoned the practice, but we have not escaped its shadow. It lingers in the words we use to describe our most destructive impulses. It fuels our most potent nightmares of monstrous evil. And it stands as the final unbreachable line that even the most desperate among us cross only with the deepest psychological cost. The Conqueror's banquet is closed, but we still dream of it. We still fear it. And in our language, our legends, and our laws, we continue to define ourselves and our civilization by the line we will not cross. The ghost of the act remains, a permanent resident in the human psyche, reminding us of the ancient hungers that civilization was built to contain. We began in the dust of a forgotten battlefield, with a king who did not just defeat his enemy, but consumed him, flesh, bone, and soul. We called it a weapon, a ritual, a philosophy of absolute power. We have journeyed through the sacred temples of Tenochtitlan, the strategic war camps of ancient China, the tyrannical courts of mad emperors, and the shocked perspectives of foreign witnesses. We have traced the anthropology of this power, its decline and its ghostly persistence in our modern language and legends. Now we arrive at the end of our exploration, not with a simple answer, but with a profound and unsettling truth to confront. The story of cannibalism in warfare is not a grotesque sidebar to human history. It is a dark mirror held up to our very nature. It forces us to stare into the abyss and recognize that the line between civilization and barbarism is not a wall, but a blurry, shifting border that we have crossed countless times. To study this is to understand that the capacity for the unthinkable resides within the framework of the thinkable, that the ultimate horror can be born from the same human mind that creates art, philosophy, and law. The Aztec priest making an offering to Huitzilopochtli was not a madman. He was a devout man, a pillar of a complex, sophisticated, and in many ways glorious civilization. His act of ritual consumption was, within his worldview, as necessary and logical as a farmer planting a seed to feed his people. The Chinese general forcing a son to eat his father's flesh was not merely a monster. He was a brilliant, if terrifying, strategist, applying a brutal logic to the problem of psychological domination. This is the most difficult truth to accept, that these acts emerged from a place of reason, not mindless savagery. They were extreme solutions to universal human questions: how to appease the gods, how to secure victory, how to project power. This forces us to dismantle the comfortable dichotomy we have built between the civilized and the barbaric. They are not separate territories. They are intertwined impulses within the same human spirit. Civilization is not the absence of barbarism. It is often the set of rules we construct to manage and channel it. And sometimes, those rules themselves sanction the barbaric for what is perceived as the greater good. This practice represents the absolute endpoint of a process that is present in every conflict, large and small, the dehumanization of the enemy. To kill another human being is a profound psychological hurdle. To make it easier, we must first strip them of their humanity. We give them labels: the Hun, the Jap, the terrorist, the savage. We reduce them to a caricature, an obstacle, a number. The act of consumptive assimilation is simply this process taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. If dehumanization turns a person into a thing, then cannibalism is the ultimate use of that thing. It is the final reduction of a human life to mere matter, to fuel, to food. The Aztec ritual dehumanized the captive into a vessel for divine energy. The Qi general dehumanized his enemy into a message. Emperor Yang dehumanized his rebels into a tool for terror. In this light, the practice is not an aberration from warfare, but its purest, most honest expression. It makes literal what is always metaphorical in war: the desire to eliminate the other, to digest their threat, to make them disappear. In our modern conflicts, we may not literally eat our enemies, but the psychological process of turning them into abstractions, into collateral damage or acceptable losses, is a chilling echo of the same ancient impulse. And what of power? The journey through this history reveals a recurring, terrifying theme. The nature of true power is not merely to defeat an enemy, but to erase them. It is to dominate so completely that you rewrite reality itself. The victor writes the history, but the ultimate victor goes a step further. They consume it. They absorb the very essence of the vanquished, leaving no trace behind. The consumed enemy has no grave to become a shrine, no legacy to inspire revenge, no story to be told except the one the victor dictates. Their strength is added to your own. Their memory is obliterated. This is the conqueror's ultimate fantasy: to not just win, but to have always been the only power that ever mattered. It is the desire to make the enemy a part of you, so that their destruction becomes a form of self-creation. This is the ultimate victory, and it is also the ultimate horror. This shadow stretches long across human history, from the battlefields of antiquity to the headlines of today. We may have abolished the literal act, but have we abolished the hunger that drove it? The metaphors we use suggest otherwise. We still seek to devour our competitors, to consume content, to see our enemies crushed and destroyed. The language of consumption remains the language of ultimate power. The psychological process of dehumanization that made cannibalism possible is still the essential fuel of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and hate crimes across the globe. We have simply found new, more technologically advanced, and sometimes more insidious ways to erase those we deem other. So what do we do with this knowledge? We cannot unsee what we have learned. We cannot return to the simple comfort of believing that such acts are the province of savages or madmen from a distant past. This history is our history. This potential is our potential. To confront the unthinkable is not to despair for humanity, but to understand it more fully, and in doing so, to vigilantly guard against these darkest impulses. It is to recognize the dehumanizing rhetoric that precedes atrocity and to challenge it. It is to question the absolute exercise of power in all its forms. It is to remember that the opposite of cannibalism is not just vegetarianism, it is empathy. It is the recognition of the shared humanity in the other, the refusal to reduce a person to a thing, the commitment to see a soul instead of a resource. The king on that ancient battlefield sought to erase his enemy by making him a part of himself. In a tragic irony, he succeeded, but not in the way he intended. The stories of these acts have survived for millennia. The victims have not been erased. Their story, told through the shocking nature of their ends, has become immortal. They are a permanent part of us now, not consumed but remembered. They serve as a warning, a lesson, a shadow that forces us to look inward. The Conqueror's banquet is over, but the echo of the feast remains, a permanent whisper in the human ear, reminding us of what we are capable of and challenging us, always, to choose a better path. The true measure of our civilization is not that we have forgotten this darkness, but that we remember it, confront it, and consistently choose to build a world where such a thing is not just forbidden, but truly unthinkable.